1963, Malaya had 70 diplomats, Indonesia had 3,000, and they were destroying us in the Middle East. Here is the story of how Malaysia's policy on the Middle East began. 28 March 1963, remember that date? That is the date when the Lebanese embassy in Karachi, Pakistan, requested an agreement to accredit its ambassador to Kuala Lumpur. We did not know it then, but that would lead to a chain of events that shaped Malaysia's foreign policy on the Middle East that you see today. Tunku Abdul Rahman was the Prime Minister. Tun Ghazali Shafi was the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry for External Affairs, as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was then known. And just 2 months before that, Sukarno had declared Konfrontasi on Malaya.
In 1963, Indonesia had many internal problems, both economic and political. In September of that year, Malaysia became a reality. Sukarno, plagued with his internal problems, saw the formation of Malaysia as a part solution to them. It was an expedient move to say Malaysia was a threat to Indonesia, that Malaysia was a plot of British imperialism, and thus unite the nation. This was the scene in Jakarta in February this year to rally called to support the president and restate the people's determination to crush Malaysia. The people were told that their own problems could not be solved until the confrontation of Malaysia had succeeded.
The very idea of Malaysia, with Sabah and Sarawak joining the peninsula, was seen as a neo-colonial project by President Sukarno of Indonesia. And they argued that Malaysia was a neo-colonial project. With 3,000 diplomats all across the developing world, they were telling that story to everyone. If Sukarno's Indonesia had managed to convince the Afro-Asian world or the developing countries, as it was then known, that Malaysia was an illegitimate project, then Malaysia would not have been able to get international recognition. That is the backdrop of the story today. Hi, I'm Dr. Ilango Karpanan, former Malaysian ambassador. This is the untold story of how Lebanon shaped Malaysia's Middle East diplomacy. The events of 1963 triggered Malaysia's foreign policy on the Middle East. Earlier I told you that on 28 March 1963, Lebanon requested agreement for its ambassador in Pakistan to be sent to Kuala Lumpur. After that, something strange happened. Kuala Lumpur granted the agreement, but the Lebanese ambassador in Karachi never turned up to Kuala Lumpur to present his credentials. And even more surprising, Lebanon also turned down the invitation from the government of Malaysia to attend the proclamation ceremony of Malaysia in September. 2 years down the road, at the height of the Konfrontasi, the government was preparing a visit of the king to several countries in the Middle East, including Lebanon. And when the request was made for the king to visit Lebanon, Lebanon remained silent. Silent. No response at all. Now that would have been odd, but again, we were fighting the Konfrontasi. There was no time to sit and think deeply, and the matter was forgotten. The king continued on his trip to the Middle East without Lebanon. The foreign ministry did not see it then, but one Malaysian diplomat did. Malaysia's ambassador to Cairo, Dato' Yaakob Latif, reported that there were many Indonesian delegations visiting the Middle East and North Africa. Among them was an individual named Madam Supeni, a very popular, charismatic lady. Indonesia's voice resonated because Indonesia was a respected member of the Afro-Asian group. And then it came, the headlines that changed everything. The newspapers in Khartoum, Sudan screamed, Malaysia, Far East Israel. And then one day, Pakistan suddenly broke off diplomatic ties with Malaysia. Remember, you know that Indonesia had already broken off diplomatic ties with Malaysia, Philippines as well. Now the third country had also done so. The diplomatic cables that came from Cairo and from the few other posts that we had overseas at that time showed that there was some form of an alliance forming between Sukarno's Indonesia, Pakistan, and China. Remember, I'm talking about in the 1960s, right? They were together forming this narrative about Malaysia being a neo-colonial project. We figured that Indonesia must have made headway in the Middle East, and Lebanon too must have come under influence. Suddenly, Lebanon's strange actions made sense. It was clear Malaysia needed to have an additional presence in the Middle East. I told you earlier that Malaysia only had embassies in Cairo and Jeddah. So the search for the third post started. And that is how Beirut came to be chosen. Cosmopolitan city, the country had free press, and many embassies were present there. So it would have been a good place for Malaysia to counter Indonesia's narrative. The only problem was Indonesia had beaten us to the ground. We needed to have a strategy, and the country was full of debate about this whole thing. Some political parties were accusing the government of failing to counter Indonesia's narrative within the Afro-Asian group, and as a result of which Malaysia was isolated. It was not invited, it was blocked. Then there were other political parties that were criticizing Malaysia for being too lenient with Israel. As a result of this active parliamentary debates and discussions and deliberations, the first policy was shifting from a pro-West policy to non-alignment. But the problem was the Tunku did not like this language at all. To him, non-alignment was synonymous with the socialist and communist countries. And you must remember, communism was a concern at that time. But if we were to defeat Indonesia at the Konfrontasi, there was no choice. We had to also align ourselves with this policy of non-alignment, because the whole of the Middle East, and particularly Cairo, the leader of the Arab League, was non-aligned. So, well before Konfrontasi ended, Malaysia had already started to shift to non-alignment. The second policy shift concerned its policy on the Middle East. Prior to the Konfrontasi, Middle East was important. Malaysia followed closely the conflict between the Arabs and the Israelis, but after the Konfrontasi had started, things were no longer the same. Indonesia's campaign labeling Malaysia as something like the Far East Israel was not something that could be taken lightly. Malaysia had to fight this, and the way to do it was to align itself closely with the Arab states in their conflict with Israel. So the Middle East policy had to become a high priority for Malaysia. And Malaysia also decided that its policy on the Middle East would be one where it followed the lead of the Arab countries. And that had been Malaysia's stance on the Middle East from that time until today. The third policy shift, a natural extension of its alignment with the Arab states, was to cut all ties with Israel. Every single link had to be cut. Before Konfrontasi, Malaysia had trade links with Israel. Israeli goods were freely available in Malaysia and in Singapore. In fact, Israel also had a trading company in Kuala Lumpur at that time. These ties began, of course, before the country became independent. But after the events of 1963, when Malaysia had to become aligned with the Arab states, all this was no longer possible. Trade ties were cut, social ties, cultural, scientific, education, everything had to be severed. This was not enough, argued some political parties with strong Malay Muslim grassroots. They argued that Malaysia should de-recognize Israel like all other Arab countries at that time. But this was a dilemma for Malaysia. You see, in 1957, when Malaya became independent, Israel was one of the countries that had recognized Malaya at that time. Because of this strong push from the ground, the government had allowed a full-day parliamentary debate in 1960 about whether or not the country should recognize Israel. The position that was eventually taken was that Malaysia would recognize Israel as a country because it had already been formed, it was accepted by the international community, but Malaysia would not have any form of diplomatic ties with Israel. These three shifts arose out of Indonesia's diplomatic warfare. They defined Malaysia's foreign policy until today. Only after these three shifts did Malaysia accredit an ambassador to Beirut. Its presence there gave a bridge to the Arab world. The events of that period underpins Malaysia's actions across a number of policy issues. Malaysia's position in the OIC, Malaysia's stance on the issue of Palestine, the Gaza conflict, Malaysia's stance on the Global South, even BRICS, they're all linked to that event of the 1960s when Malaysia had to fight for its own survival. Survival meant winning the battle of legitimacy in the Middle East. Legitimacy in the Middle East means prioritizing Middle East policy. All of it goes back to one date, 28 March 1963. I have spent 33 years of my life as a diplomat, 5 years of it as ambassador in Beirut. I have watched closely how the events of 1963 have shaped Malaysia's policy on the Middle East. This episode is part of a much larger story that I'm exploring in my upcoming book on Malaysia's engagement with Lebanon and the Middle East. And that crisis and the policy shifts that followed tells us a number of things. One of the most important lessons is that foreign policy is not crafted out of emotions. It is crafted out of careful consideration of the events, the data on the ground, and taking concrete steps and actions to address them. This is the untold story of the origins of Malaysia's foreign policy on the Middle East. I'm telling them one video at a time. If you liked this video, I would like you to subscribe to this channel so that you will be kept informed of future videos of this kind. Thank you very much.